It's like a history of climate work.
Friends, can I invite you to since we are we will start with the panel in a few minutes. Can I invite our panelists to go to the stage?
Good, yeah.
In introduction, we are very fortunate today to have an amazing panel. Today with us, we have Mr. Selwyn Hart. We have also Dr. Oppenheimer, Dr. Fletcher, and Mr. Green. I will introduce all of them when we get the floor. But first of all, I will invite Mr. Selwyn Hart to share with us his perspective on the latest development and maybe tell us give us some insights about what's going to happen this week. Mr. Selwyn Hart is the director of the UN Secretary General's Climate Change Support Team. He provides advice and expertise to Mr. Ban Ki-moon and on key climate issues. He has played a pivotal role in the success of the climate negotiations at COP21 in Paris, but also before. As Selwyn was also a lead negotiator for Barbados and also the Alliance of Small Island States. He served in different capacities in the climate process, including as a founding board member of the Kyoto Protocol Adaptation Fund. So thank you, Selwyn, again for being with us today. I know you have an incredibly busy schedule, so please, have the floor.
Thanks, and thank you, Leticia, and good morning to fellow panelists and to all. The significant events that will take place during the General Assembly week. We expect that between the countries that will actually join the Paris Agreement at this high-level event on the 21st, and those that will commit to joining this year through recorded videos and other means, that we will be virtually assured that the climate agreement, that the Paris Agreement will enter into force this year. This is a remarkable development. This agreement was only adopted in December last year, just 9 months ago. It certainly reflects the urgency of the climate challenge and the need for countries to move quickly to reduce emissions and ensure a climate resilient future. This achievement, as I just said, or potential achievement, is extremely remarkable. Usually, international treaties of this nature with entry into force provisions as stringent as the Paris Agreement take many years and sometimes decades. The fact that we are on the cusp of entry into force of the Paris Agreement less than 1 year after its adoption is a really remarkable achievement, and it, as I said earlier, it reflects the continued political support that governments have for responding to the challenge of climate change, but also seeking to reap the benefits and opportunities of a low-carbon, climate resilient future. As you all know, in April this year, April 22nd, 175 parties to the UNFCCC signed the Paris Agreement. What we're seeing with the adoption of the Paris Agreement, the record number of countries signing this agreement, and the potential for the agreement to enter into force this year is really good for multilateralism. It shows that countries working together can achieve really great things. Now, you all know that the agreement needs 55 countries representing 55% of global emissions for it to enter into force. The Secretary General has been urging leaders all over the world to join this agreement. We currently have 28 countries that are party to the agreement, representing 39% of global emissions. We honestly expect over 20 countries, 20 more parties to join the agreement this week, over at least, I'm saying at least, we expect more. The percentage of global emissions threshold, we all acknowledge it's a bit harder to cross. However, we're seeing many major economies and countries with significant emissions expressing a willingness to join the agreement this year. And the leadership of China and the US and convincing other major economies to join the Paris Agreement and also leading by example. That's what global leadership is all about. And I think both countries should be congratulated for helping us to reach this stage. We're also very encouraged by the news coming out of Europe, where Europe has significantly signaled that it's willing to move up its timeline for ratifying the Paris Agreement and are working towards a 2016 timeline for joining the Paris Agreement. This again, I'm using remarkable often, but it truly is another remarkable achievement. Finally, I will just tell you how the Secretary General intends to structure this day. Now, we only have, it's not an all-day event, we just have 1 hour. It's the busiest time of the year. There are hundreds of leaders in town, and many things are happening. And as you know, this world is beset by many political issues and concerns and matters. But we've been able to dedicate 1 hour for this event. The primary focus will be on countries depositing their instruments of ratification at this event. And as I said, we're expecting more than 100. The Secretary General also invited leaders to submit recorded videos expressing their commitment to join the Paris Agreement. And we will be showing a montage video with clips from various leaders. You will be very surprised to see some of the leaders that pop up in that video and really some of the ambitious commitments that they're making to join this Paris Agreement. So I'm encouraging some smart individuals, this room is filled with smart individuals, that at the end of the day, to sort of calculate the number of countries that deposit plus the number of countries and their emissions that commit to ratify. And it will be very clear to all that entry into force of the Paris Agreement in 2016, what seemed impossible is now inevitable. So with that, I thank you, and unfortunately I have to pop out, but again, I thank all of you for your support. Many of you, I see many familiar faces, Ayman, Fran, and then many other colleagues as well, who have been at the front lines of the fight against climate change, and who have been some of the biggest supporters of a truly multilateral response. And what we're seeing now is a coalition of small emitters, the SIDS and the LDCs. They're part of that 55-country group. But you're also seeing larger countries, the major emitters, assuming much greater responsibility and taking concrete action to address climate change. And it's the United Nations that provides that platform to support multilateral action to address pressing global problems like climate change. So as we move into the phase, we need to get entry to force behind us. We'll get it out of the way this year, and we move into the hardcore implementation phase, where we need to finalize all the design elements to ensure that the Paris Agreement makes a dent in climate change that we all need and expect. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Selwyn, for being with us today. Thank you for all your work. I think you've been a very important player in the negotiation and now getting the Paris Agreement to enter into force. So thank you for all your work. And you were mentioning smart people doing some work on the numbers. Well, we have our ratification tracker. So again, for the second time, I really invite you to go on the website and follow Wednesday. See those numbers going up as more countries are committing to ratify the agreement. And yes, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when now. Thank you very much. So now I will invite our next panelist to share with us his perspective. Dr. Oppenheimer is the Director of the Science, Technology, and Environmental Policy at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University. He's a Chief Scientist and Advisor to the Environmental Defense Fund. Dr. Oppenheimer has been researching the science behind the climate system since 1987 and has participated in every assessment report produced by the IPCC. The IPCC is the panel, as you know, that was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1997. So it's a great pleasure to have you here today. You have the floor.
So thank you for that kind introduction, and it's also my pleasure to be here. And I want to align my comments a little bit with the presentations, the very good presentations we heard this morning. So I'm going to lead by commenting on the natural science of the 1.5 degree question, talk about feasibility, and somewhat about the politics of even raising the issue. And I want to say, just from a personal point of view, that for many years I was skeptical of engaging on this question, not just as an expert, but the question of whether it was wise to encourage the countries to engage on it. I've come around, and I think it is an important issue that needs to be dealt with by smart people who have a chance to look at these issues and analyze them carefully. With regard to the science, I had a role in working group 2 of the most recent IPCC report, and there, in the framework of the reasons for concern and the burning embers diagram, a pretty clear case was made that there are discernible benefits to restraining warming to 1.5 degrees, just based only on the impacts, not considering the issues of cost and feasibility of getting there. The effects on unique and threatened systems like coral reefs, or like the Arctic systems, and importantly, when we talk about these systems, talking about systems that are not just ice or not just coral, but involve the people and communities whose livelihoods depend on ice and coral, for instance, that those reach a higher degree of threat, significantly so at 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees than at 1.5 degrees. And a similar conclusion could be drawn, although a little less firmly, with somewhat less confidence, for extreme weather events like extreme heat. So the case was there, and the case was developed for the negotiators in the context of the structured expert dialogue that took place in the run-up to Paris. And although I didn't participate in that, I understood that the arguments made there, just based on the science, were fairly compelling. And of course, there's been a lot of progress on the science since then. So there is a basis for distinguishing as far as I'm concerned. In terms of feasibility, feasibility is a complex issue. It's not just a matter of technical feasibility, it's also a matter of political feasibility and social feasibility. And we are not good at projecting any of that. We stink at projecting technological change. We have only the most rudimentary tools for talking about what happens in terms of political and social environments that actually encourage or inhibit changes to occur. So although the feasibility of achieving 1.5 degrees looks extremely difficult, and many of my colleagues think it impossible, at least without an overshoot, I want everybody to bear in mind how challenged we are at making such statements like that about the future, and how some things do change very fast, that getting the whole world to change fast is obviously a tall order, but that things happen that we haven't got the ability to predict well. And I'll give an example, which is people talked a long time about the collapse in prices in the renewable energy market, and finally it happened. And no one was able to say that it would be a feature of the late 2000s, that was when it was going to happen. And it happened in some ways a lot quicker when it started to happen than anyone could have imagined. Similarly, on a somewhat smaller scale, but also, no matter what you think of hydrofracking, it's got an influence in the greenhouse gas, in the outcomes of the greenhouse gas discussions and in the real world. There have been 40 or 50 years of research on hydrofracking and horizontal drilling. And nothing happened, and nothing happened, and nothing happened. And then overnight, it revolutionized the exploitation of natural gas reserves. Those are the kind of changes, which, by the way, have a governmental component. The US government played a heavy role in funding that research. The Chinese government, perhaps in sort of a dance with the German government, the Germans on the demand side, the Chinese on the supply side, played a strong role in making the renewable energy prices collapse so fast. But that these things are not predictable. And but it does show that large changes can occur very quickly and unexpectedly. And always keep that in mind when we talk about feasibility. Final point I want to make has to do with the politics of the issue. Again, something that's very difficult to project. Obviously, things that are not really dependent on the climate world itself, but which strongly influence the climate world, can have an effect on the likelihood of a target like 1.5 degrees being achieved. So, for instance, in my country, we have an election coming up soon. The outcome of that election probably will be influential on the degree of seriousness that my government takes in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, and then moving forward aggressive in terms of ambition towards either a 1.5 or 2 degree target. I used to think that the likelihood of that raising the 1.5 degree target would create a political backlash by the major governments, that it would draw their attention mostly to the infeasibility issue, and it would undermine the possibility of actually even achieving 2 degrees, because they back off the whole Article 2 concept that we need a long-term target, because they see the great difficulties that the science has raised. But I've changed my mind, especially in the follow-up of what's happened since Paris and in the run-up to Paris. It's pretty clear to me, at least for now, that the 1.5 degree target, discussion of it, raises the attention of governments on the Article 2 issues. It demonstrates to them the level of ambition that's really necessary, not just for 1.5, but even for 2 degrees, and therefore has actually sharpened, speeded up, and focused the discussion in a very constructive way. Now that can change. We need to be awake to things like that changing. But for the time being, I think the framework for grappling with the 1.5 degree issue is there. I think it's favorable, so I think this is a discussion that needs to go forward rapidly. And I'm glad to see IPCC is set up to actually help us by producing what will be, I think, a very relevant and important report. So just in conclusion, from my point of view, the key point is to stick to the science, as with all aspects of this issue. Not exaggerate either on the science parts of it or on the feasibility aspects of it. Let's not underestimate the difficulty of this challenge, because by underestimating it will make it less likely we'll ever get there, or even to 2 degrees. And we would undermine our own credibility as players in the discussion. So let's not underestimate the challenges, but let's do the best we can to improve the chances of getting there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Oppenheimer, for realistic but yet hopeful message in your intervention. So now I will invite Dr. James Fletcher to share with us his perspective on this issue. Dr. Fletcher, as the former Minister of Environment and Energy of St. Lucia, brings an incredible wealth of experience on climate, energy, agriculture. But he has also served in different capacities on sustainable development with the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean States. He's been a senator and a cabinet member for the government in St. Lucia. But the Dr. Fletcher who's with us today is the climate champion. Dr. Fletcher is among those key negotiators, and we have some obvious one in the room that I will call on later. But he's one of these key people who in Paris worked relentlessly, days and nights and days, for the inclusion of the 1.5 degree target in the Article 2 of the Paris Agreement. So, Dr. Fletcher, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Letitia, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to be a little controversial and say that, particularly for someone like me whose entire background is science, all my training has been in science, and I very proudly said that I am a scientist, to say that one of the things I learned on becoming Minister of the Environment and Solution, having to push the climate change cause, was the fact that science is not enough. And really, it was something that hit me very forcefully, that the scientists, the negotiators, the technical people in our ministries, in our governments, not just in St. Lucia, but throughout the Caribbean, were not being effective in getting the message across, not just within the region, because our region really was not alive to the issues that climate change was posing to the Caribbean. But even internationally, when we were entering into negotiations, we found that, yes, the scientific argument was a very strong one. It continues to become a very compelling one for 1.5 degrees Celsius. But there appeared to be something missing. And the discussion for me, despairingly sometimes, appeared to be almost an academic or esoteric argument about numbers. And it was necessary for us to change that discussion and make people realize that for us in the Caribbean, 1.5 degrees Celsius is not an esoteric academic discussion. It's an existential issue. It is an issue of life. Because we may be seduced into thinking that 1.5 degrees Celsius is that holy grail that we search for. And once we keep temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius, everything will be all right. But it's not. At below 1.5 degrees Celsius, at 1 degree Celsius, we are already seeing some very significant impacts of climate change in all of our countries, in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in the Indian region. Before we hit 1 degree Celsius last year, we were already seeing significant increases in drought, increase of stronger extreme weather events like storms. Every single one of our countries has had to deal with an extreme weather event in the last 10 to 15 years. And when I speak of extreme weather events, I'm not talking about an extreme weather event like Katrina. As devastating as Katrina was for New Orleans, life went on in the rest of the United States. As devastating as Sandy was for the eastern seaboard of the United States, life went on for the rest of the country. When Hurricane Gilbert hit Jamaica, 365% of Jamaica's gross domestic product was destroyed in 24 hours. And that's not Kingston, Jamaica, that's not Montego Bay, that's not Ocho Rios, that's not Negril. That is the entire country paralyzed and coming to a standstill and not knowing what will happen next because of the passage of one extreme weather event. When Hurricane Ida hit Grenada, you could not find one roof left on any building in Grenada. 203% of its GDP destroyed in the space of 24 hours. And again, we say that when you use metrics like GDP per capita to determine the success, the economic success of a country, a vulnerable country like those in the Caribbean, you have to understand that in the space of 24 hours, GDP per capita can go from looking very rosy to very dismal with the passage of one storm. Tropical Storm Erica hit Dominica last year, 94% of its GDP destroyed. So the impacts of extreme weather events in the Caribbean, in small island developing states, are very different to the impacts of extreme weather events in large countries. So that's why it was necessary for us to reframe the argument and make people understand that really we're speaking life and death. So yes, I understand the argument as was presented to me when I was co-facilitating with Tina Santoff, the minister from Norway, on the long-term temperature goal of countries like Saudi Arabia and the Emirates that a 1.5 degree long-term temperature goal would spell, in their words, ruin for the economies that are based so much on fossil fuels. And I said to them, okay, well, let's look at the trade-off. It will spell economic ruin for you. It is already causing death and destruction and loss of livelihoods in my country and the countries of the Caribbean, in countries like the Seychelles, the Maldives, and Marshall Islands every single day. So I don't think we talk about things on the same scale. And that's why we felt it was necessary to make the argument about more than just science, make the argument one that people understood the impact that climate change was having on every single sector in our country. Infrastructure. You could understand the passage of a hurricane or tropical storm, the damage it would do to infrastructure. Infrastructure that was already very, very vulnerable and not built to withstand the sort of weather events that we're having now. Things that used to be 1 in 100 year events are now becoming 1 in 10 year events. Impacts on agriculture, impacts on our fisheries with ocean acidification and sea surface temperature increases, and the impact that can have on a country like St. Lucia or a country like the Seychelles that depends so much on its blue economy for livelihoods of rural people and the contribution that fisheries makes to the national economy. Impacts on public health. You know, we're seeing now the entry of public health issues like chikungunya and Zika virus that before we never saw. And there was a study done, I think 2 years ago by the Lancet University College London that said that climate change will pose the biggest challenge to public health in the 21st century, and we're already seeing it. Impacts on tourism. Our entire tourism infrastructure is along our coast. The jugular of the Caribbean is along the coastline. Every single economic asset is along the coastline. Our power stations, our airports, our seaports, our schools, our hospitals, everything is along the coastline. So when you start speaking about sea level rise, when you start speaking about the impacts of storm surges, you are dealing with the heart of the economy of every single one of these countries. So in every single economic sector, we are already seeing the impact of climate change. And that's why for us, we needed to make this not just a scientific argument, but also to some extent an emotional argument, to get people to understand that 1.5 degrees Celsius is not the holy grail. We really should be keeping temperatures to below 1.5 because we're already seeing the impacts below 1.5. And that's why last year, again, we changed the way in which we approach things. We got civil society involved, we got our young people involved, we got the Caribbean Youth Environment Network with this catchy slogan 1.5 to stay alive, and they really gravitated towards this and they made a big clarion call, and they were putting pressure on us that we could not have come back from Paris without an ambitious climate change agreement. We got our journalists to get enthused about a climate change discussion where previously they had no interest in it. They were just concerned about prime figures and politics and the mundane things that people like us don't bother ourselves too much with. But we got our journalists interested in 1.5 degrees because they understood what 1.5 degrees and what climate change meant to their future and the future of the countries that they were so invested in. And we got our artists, our calypsonians, our reggae singers, and our poets, and our playwrights to again embrace the climate change discussion. And that made a big difference because then climate change was not just an issue for environmental ministers or energy ministers. It became an issue for the finance minister. It became an issue for the tourism minister. It became an issue for the prime minister. And you had prime ministers from every single Caribbean country going to Paris and making very strong statements on behalf of Caribbean countries and asking for strong, ambitious agreement coming out of Paris. So that made our role in Paris in the negotiations a lot easier. I will say one thing that I don't think I've said publicly. I do not believe that, forget the name Paris Agreement, I do not believe we would have had a strong climate change agreement if those discussions had been held anywhere but Paris last year. I think the forces aligned very well. The French presidency was very committed to a strong, ambitious climate change agreement, and we must not discount the role that Laurent Fabius and the French presidency, together with Ban Ki-moon and his team, played in guiding the discussions and guiding that agreement in a particular direction. Because there were some very strong forces opposed to an ambitious climate change agreement. I can tell you when we went into Paris very skeptical whether we would come out with anything that spoke about loss and damage as a separate issue, separate and apart from adaptation, whether there would have been any reference to 1.5 degrees Celsius as a long-term temperature goal, whether we would have had a five-year global stop date so that you could synchronize mitigation ambition with science. We got all of these things and more in Paris. That has a lot to do with really a triumph of multilateralism and how, as Selvin said, how the French ensure that all views contended. Earlier we heard that we saw a presentation on the impact of climate change on the achievement of the SDGs. I can tell you for our countries, if we do not address the climate change issues, we will not achieve the sustainable development goals. Because every single one of our countries is a constant cycle of repair and recovery. No sooner do we come out of one extreme weather event, be it a drought like we had in 2010, we had Hurricane Thomas in St. Lucia in 2010, then we had an out of season trough that killed 6 people and wreaked havoc in 3 of our countries in 2013, I think it was. You can't be devoting so much of your domestic resources to repair and recovery and still have money to deal with the SDGs. So unless we deal with climate change, and unless we mitigate the impacts of climate change, you could forget any single one of these countries ever implementing that 2030 agenda. So the climate change and the 2030 agenda are inextricably linked, and those are issues that we really must address. So I just felt it necessary probably to be a little bit to take this off the beaten path. Don't get me wrong, I'm a very strong advocate for the science. My degrees are all in science. It's been my entire life as a scientist, but sometimes science is not enough. Sometimes you have to tug at people's heartstrings. You have to reach an emotional argument and get people to realize that for us, it's not about numbers, it's about survival. For every single small island developing state, for every member of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, for every climate vulnerable country, this is about survival. And we can't start worrying about whether it's possible or not possible. If you're going to have a discussion about whether it's possible or not possible, then you're making decisions about whether people live or die, whether livelihoods remain or they disappear. And I don't think that's an argument we want to reduce to. So I just felt that it's really issue to take it to that direction.
Thank you very much for a very thought-provoking presentation. And you notice the climate alarm went off as you were speaking. But yes, indeed, thank you very much for your contribution, and it also shows how important it is to keep the momentum going from Paris. So we will now move to our last but not least panelist, Nathaniel Green, who's the Director of Renewable Energy Policy at the National Resources Defense Council and a specialist in utility management, energy efficiency, and regulation. He has worked across the US, advising state and local governments on the deployment of clean energy, and he is also a leading expert on emerging technologies such as fuel cells and energy storage. So, Nathaniel, the floor is yours. Please tell us about the solutions.
Thank you, Leticia, and thank you to Climate Analytics for hosting this morning. It's been really interesting, exciting. We'll see if I'm not also the least. But I do actually think, though my experience is very much domestic, my thoughts build very much on what we've heard so far this morning. Some of you may have read the reports from really the summer of renewable energy jobs surpassing jobs in the fossil fuel industry globally this year, which I think are also reflected here in the United States, where for the first time jobs in the solar sector passed the oil and gas extraction and also passed coal extraction. you add wind jobs in there, energy efficiency related jobs, clean transportation jobs, it's pretty clear that the clean energy economy is now bigger than the fossil fuel economy in terms of jobs, so the human impact. And that really, it shouldn't be surprising given the incredibly sustained growth we've seen in renewable energy deployment and more broadly in clean energy deployment, certainly here in the United States and globally. There was one of those articles, a sort of stunning statistic that wind energy technician, position of wind energy technician is now the fastest growing job title in the United States according to the U.S. labor statistics. And against that background, I had the occasion this summer to travel to Wyoming to visit a huge wind project out there. And it was fascinating to be there because I was at the sort of heart of this wind project. We could look down in the valley and see the coal plant that sort of symbolizes a lot of what the Wyoming economy has been about, certainly for many decades now. And Wyoming is losing coal jobs very rapidly as the coal industry in the United States has been shrinking. It's been gaining wind jobs simultaneously, but not as fast. And the state is sort of locked in economic competition with its neighbor Colorado, doing a lot more wind manufacturing than Wyoming is. And I think that sort of competition is very much emblematic of what we're starting to see globally, where we have U.S. and China locked in competition around solar development in countries around the world, starting to really engage in the clean energy economy, like any other part of their mainstream economy. So really the economic momentum around the solution set that we're talking about here today is real, and it's hugely encouraging. On the other hand, the gap between where we are headed, driven by that momentum under business as usual, and where we need to get to achieve 2 degrees or even better, 1.5 degrees, is fairly stunning. Here in the United States, business as usual will take us about half of the way in renewables towards where we need to get by 2030, and probably only about 25% of the way where we need to get by 2050, just to get to 2 degrees. As you heard earlier, that all needs to happen even faster if we're going to achieve 1.5. So, you know, there's that saying out there that the Stone Age didn't end for lack of stones. I think we can say at this point, it's pretty clear that the fossil fuel age isn't going to end for lack of fossil fuels. Renewables, and broader clean energy economy really do provide us with a host of services that are more attractive ultimately and will win over fossil fuels. But the question is, will they win fast enough? I think that is where the question of political feasibility comes into play, and that's where really, I think it's not just the science around 1.5 and the impacts, it's really about the human and political impacts. That's where I think these job statistics become so central and so fascinating. Will the political economy turn fast enough so we have the race at the top that we need to survive? And I think there are some signs out there, at least here in the United States, that are fairly encouraging. The leadership states here in the United States, the one we're sitting in right now, California, Hawaii, have ratcheted up their targets substantially. Now, 50% renewables target by 2030 here. Cities across the country are taking leadership roles. There's a lot more discussion about 100% renewable targets by some of our cities. And we're starting to see pushback from the local population against attacks against renewables. There's been a long struggle over the last year or so in Nevada around solar, and now we've finally seen really the local population, the local interests around solar, the homeowners that have installed it, pushing back against the political attacks in that state, and winning reinstatement of some critical policies there. And across the country, if you look at our states that have been in their efforts, they really are already on track to comply with our Clean Power Plan, the President's primary climate policy, even though that policy right now is in abeyance while the courts decide its legality. So the fact that their states are moving ahead, in most cases through their agencies and their politics, but in any case through their economy, because the installations are on track for compliance, I think is both encouraging politically. It also means it opens up the door to strengthen that key policy when it does come back into effect. The legal challenge, probably counter to the folks that brought the challenge, does offer that opportunity. And I think that fits very nicely to what we heard earlier about the critical nature globally of the 5-year reviews. That's the sort of pressure that we need here in this country, and I think around the world to help keep us on track. But going back to the example of Wyoming, despite this sort of I think signs of progress, Wyoming, despite its clear decision that they face in that state about where their jobs will be in the future, and the real competition they're facing between themselves and their neighbor Colorado, and the huge potential that they sit on with just a tremendous wind resource. They have a wind tax. They're the only state in the union that taxes wind development. So even though I think all the signs point in the right direction, we need the political will, and there's still significant challenges to turning our economy, turning our politics to take advantage of all the solutions that are out there.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Nevertheless, my takeaway from your presentation is whatever the result of the presidential election, the energy revolution has started in the US, and it's inevitable now. So, thank you very much to all our panelists. We will now open the floor for questions, comments, remarks, reactions. You have here 3 experts, so please, we are waiting on your questions. Again, please state your name and organization, and try to speak up because unfortunately we don't have the mic in the room. Yes.
I'm Bill Hewitt. I'm a writer and I teach at NYU's Center for Global Affairs. We've heard appropriately a tremendous amount about energy, and what we have not heard about today, we have referenced food security, but on the flip side, agriculture is an enormous source of greenhouse gases. And I think it is incredibly relevant that we all focus a little bit more on that. I think it's obviously critically important that we get at eliminating coal, eliminating oil, etc. But to what extent can we further the agenda of 7 billion tons of carbon dioxide equivalent annually from just the livestock sector? So that's an open question to all of you.
Well, I can probably tell you during the negotiations on the local temperature rule, that exact question was posed to me by the delegate from Argentina. Whereas, like I said, I had the Saudis, I had some of the like-minded developing countries coming up to me and complaining about how difficult 1.5 degrees Celsius would be for the economy. The chief negotiator from Argentina came up to me and said, "You are going to kill my lifestyle sector." For us to 1.5 degrees Celsius is a serious food security issue for us, and for us to achieve 1.5 degrees Celsius, the amount of CO2 equivalent we would have to take out as a result of our livestock sector would be crippling to our livestock sector. Like I said, I'm not insensitive to this, and it is an issue that we will have to discuss. But you're absolutely right. It is, when we speak of CO2 equivalents, we often do not look at the agricultural sector, but it is a very significant overlook. Maybe not for the scientists, but I think for general discussion.
The Argentine soy sector as well is very relevant to livestock, obviously.
One thing that would help would be if the developed countries took the lead in treating their agricultural sectors like they do any other living sector, rather than favoring it, showering it with at least as much subsidies as the fossil fuel sectors, and at least in the United States, treating it very delicately politically. And I think it's true in the EU too. There are, you know, as countries develop, there's been a tendency to adopt Western-style diets, which are not so good from the greenhouse gas point of view. That is hard, you know, that's a cultural matter. On the other hand, it's a cultural preference which is supported by the governmental favoritism that's shown in certain types of agriculture. So we have to start treating these sectors more equally, and that's part of a very complex move, which eventually could see us to be less dependent on the sorts of diets that are greenhouse gas intensive.
Yeah, and they're not unrelated to the energy sector, of course, right? Because the discussion of bioenergy is solely going to exacerbate the pressures on our natural sinks, forests, grasslands, and the other thing I would say is Michael's being kind about our treatment of our agricultural sector. I mean, of course, they were instrumental in undermining climate legislation back in the late 80s, and I think, but it, you know, like coal miners, these are real jobs. These are politically powerful sectors. Until we bring them into the solution set in a way, I think it's hard to see a future where we really get where we want to go. So I think there's a lot of science to be done to figure out how do we value and bring in protection of our natural sinks, the forests, particularly in grasslands, and then how do we value better agricultural practices in the way, given how reversible those sort of investments are. I think how easily quickly go from storing carbon to releasing it home. It's not easy, but we got to find a way to bring them into those solutions.
Thank you. Any more questions, reactions? Yes, please.
You were very optimistic about the United States into some states that don't really have leaders. But there was a recent report that the agency that they published a report on pipelines that were either in construction or have been completed, and they have the capacity to carry natural gas that will put our INDC over, way over the what we have stipulated in Paris. So who's going to shut down these pipelines?
Well, and hopefully we'll build them all to start off. Well, there's a lot more that are on the drawing board. So yeah, I think that's a good question. I mean, we already have, and we saw the coal capacity numbers. It's not a question of our capacity to cook ourselves. That's already there. It's a question of will our economies and our politics turn away from that? And how do we deal with the reason that infrastructure and economy that we've already has its own momentum, has its own politics behind it? How do we retrain those workers, reuse that infrastructure to the extent possible? That, I think, is the question.
Is there any other questions? Ambassador Jumon?
Thank you. My name is Ronnie Juro. I'm Seychelles' roving ambassador for climate change and SIDS issues. I've been tweeting from here. And it's no surprise that I've been tweeting that climate analytics is providing evidence that 1.5 is feasible, it's doable, 1.5 and SDGs are achievable. Dr. Fletcher said, the discussion about sustainable development and the discussion about climate change in the small island developing states, the LDCs and our allies in Africa are not two separate discussions. They never have been. We followed the path of two processes, but they never have been. One word you've been using, or started with Tisha, or several using it is remarkable, about 1.5. Coming out post-Copenhagen, states were more or less alone fighting for 1.5. The LDCs came along, Africa joined us, the mountain countries with snow caps and glaciers realized that 1.5 was as important for all the snow caps and glaciers of the world as it is for oceans. Then the conversation changed, and yes, is 1.5 feasible, the 23 people, plus 23 people, no 23 people, all for that. In the week leading up to the climate change agreement, Paris Agreement, we were still not sure, one, whether 1.5 would be somewhere significant in the agreement, if in the agreement, and how it would be. And as Dr. Fletcher said, stars align. Since Paris, I don't even hear it. If there's one figure you're hearing at the top of all agendas now, it's actually 1.5. Finally, IPCC is going to address it. We know what IPCC is going to say. My observation from this, something for all of us to reflect on, it's not necessarily a question to the panel, is how do we change the narrative now that 1.5 is on the table to a narrative that 1.5 is doable, not between 2 degrees and 1.5. We're still sticking, I can guarantee you the states are still going to go about ambition, 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 and more ambition. That's why the High Ambition Coalition is still around, and we're not going anywhere. We're part of High Ambition Coalition. We're not going anywhere. So instead of having a narrative about, as my president would put it, don't come to me with all the obstacles to objectives we set. Come to me with the way to do it. And this is what I'm thinking about now. As we go forward, and this is the climate analytics would have chosen that type of, from the scientific point of view, but not just scientific, because we saw the SDGs, we saw the effects on health, we saw the effect on everything else. If the science in the world is still is doable, the window is closing. Yes. As far as I'm concerned, I'm going to stick my head in that window, like you're sticking your foot in the door. I'm going to stick my head in that window to try to keep it open. So I think how can we all change this narrative now? Something is it to be with. For me, that's the past. As we move on to Marrakesh, that is where do we go from here? Marrakesh has to have a message of its own. And it's going to have to be a pretty good message if it is going to hold its own as not post-Paris Agreement. This is not the post-Paris Agreement prop. Marrakesh has to stand. There are props that stand out. There's Copenhagen. That was Cancun. There's props that stand out now where we set milestones. So what is the next milestone now after Paris? So I'm sitting here as a citizen, I'm listening to it, and it's pretty raw feeling inside to hear 1.5 being talked about more and more after all the struggles we in the states have gone through. And as Dr. Fletcher said, for us in the states, LDCs, one country I always talk about is Bangladesh. country, other states, are probably suffering more from the ocean, the effects of the ocean, than most states. I'm not talking about climate events, loss of land in the oceans. I was surprised Seychelles is a champion of the blue economy. And we've had blue economy meetings. And the first blue economy summit we had in Abu Dhabi, one of the countries that spoke the most about oceans was actually Bangladesh. And they apologized for speaking about oceans. That's one of the reasons they are on fire. So let us try and find a way, and the message to our world leaders, and one of the things I tweeted is climate analytics message to world leaders gathering at UN in New York. 1.5 is doable. So let us try and find a way to change that narrative and say, it can be done. Maybe I speak like this because I'm a new grandfather for the first time. Last week I was in Seychelles for the elections. The elections didn't go too well for us, but at least I got a grandmother. And one of the things I said was it made it personal. People ask me, Ronnie, why do you do what you do? Why do you get the courage to get out in the morning at the time when you're still struggling for to do what you do? I said, you know, you're going to the emergency call. Listen to them. Our generation to future generations. It's become a term, it's become something familiar. It's for my grandchild. And if I succeed for my grandchild, I succeed for all future generations and current generations. Let us turn this narrative. Let us take that 1.5. The stars align for an agreement in Paris. Let us now align the stars for maximum ambition 1.5 and if possible lower. 1.5 is at least a benchmark we look at. And take this conversation and leave here and say, it can be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. You were one of the climate warriors here today who's been involved with the negotiation and outside of the negotiation as well, bringing this message to different stakeholders. And you're right, there is potential for stars alignment this year as well. We will have a new Secretary General at the UN, and there is room to make sure 1.5 climate change is at the top of his agenda. We have very dynamic presidency coming up soon. I have the pleasure to see Minister-elect at an event in DC, and she definitely wants to make Marrakesh a key milestone. So yes, we have the opportunity is there. Any other comments, questions from the audience? Don't be shy. You can ask any question. Absolutely.
You know, I just want to comment on the comments of the ambassador, which were terrific. You know, what needs to happen to change a narrative is that you need convincing stories. Bangladesh was served for 30 years as a convincing story of what could happen if this problem what people who believe in the necessity of 1.5 need to do is present stories which indicate the possibility of what's called rapid transformation. Now, if those stories start to happen, as they have here and there, and they can be put together in a compelling way, then the case will be easier to make. If people are inarticulate or don't go to the trouble to ferret out the places where change is happening quickly, then the whole narrative won't come together. And I would also point out that some of the governments, of course, excuse me if I'm insulting some government here, I won't be specific, don't like the idea of transformation. We should never underestimate the political obstacle that will come up to a concerted effort to meet a 1.5 degree objective or any other objective.
You have a reaction from the panel? That's a consensus right there. Do we have any questions from the room? Oh, yes, please.
I know you kind of know some of the political obstacles along the way, some of these dramatic changes. Have we thought about the infrastructure that we want to face is the timelines that we're faced with. I think it's an obstacle in itself to be able to meet those very large timelines. And I don't know if there's, I know you had mentioned the comments about reusing existing infrastructure. Are there any thoughts or ideas around how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, the ambassador mentioned the closing window, and I think a lot of that is around the infrastructure, and depending on how you think about it, right? Because you think about our auto fleets and their lifespan. If we deploy and keep using cars as long as we have been using them, then the rate of possible change is very limited. We can still bend that curve fast enough here in the States, but it's going to be a challenge. On the other hand, that assumes that we sort of take our infrastructure lifespan as a given. And that's obviously the story of, really dramatic rapid transformation. If you look back historically, think about, here in the United States, the gearing up for World War II, took a lot of infrastructure and totally remade it and reused it for different purposes. Some unfortunate things like ripping up road tracks, but some other remodeling, remaking factories and whatnot. If we think about it at that same scale, that same urgency, then those sort of rules of the rate of change become much more flexible. So, I mean, there are some simple things that people talk about using land around manufacturing facilities or power plants for solar. It's nice, not enough land in and of itself to do, but that's certainly a possibility. One big thing is going to be our transmission system, and that's not really so much a question of repurposing it or something. It's just using it better, wiser, and a greater effect. So I think a lot of it comes down to how we think of our infrastructure and how fixed we think of that, and how willing we are to recognize the costs, human costs of climate change, the human benefits of clean energy, and put those together, as Michael said, in stories that captivate and transform our politics, that we're willing to make investments that are going to have a real cost and impact in our economy now, and a payoff that's clear to all of us. We need to make it more real around the world.
If I can also add, I think there are two other issues. I remember very, very early on in the ministerial formal ministerials that preceded the Paris Agreement. In one of the discussions on ambition, still by the time was the US government special envoy on climate change, said that we should not discount the impact of new technology on increasing ambition. I fought against it immediately because I did not want us to kick that can down the road and say that, okay, technology will improve, so some of the things that are difficult now from an economic perspective or from a technological perspective will become cheaper and easier to do later on. But he is right, technology is improving, and some of the things that are difficult now, some of the things that are costly now, are becoming easier to do and cheaper to do. So I think we have to factor that in. But there's another issue that I don't think too many people have looked at. I do not believe that the countries were as ambitious in the INDCs as they could have been. The INDCs being intended to actually be total contributions, I think people really looked at the lowest level of ambition they could put on the table so that if they are held accountable for it, they knew that they could achieve it. So if I'm putting forward something and yes, okay, there was some discussion about the legally binding nature of the INDCs, but I do not believe, maybe with a few exceptions like Costa Rica and one or two others, that countries put their best possible mitigation ambition scenarios on the table in the INDCs. I think almost every single country could have done much better with the INDCs, but they were cautious about it. I think what we have to now do is say to every single one of these countries, revisit your INDCs. Tell us really what you can do. The INDCs were successful because people did not feel like their feet were being held to the fire. We now have to hold their feet to the fire and say, come on, tell us what you can do. And let's see whether we can bend that to more from the 3.7 degrees Celsius that it's at right now. Let's bend it down to 2 degrees and below 2 degrees with the current INDCs that we revise. And I think that is a discussion that must take place. Yes, they are supposed to revise the INDCs when they ratify, but I think we have to tell them, don't just revise them and just change a few words so that it looks like a different INDC. But tell us really what can you do with mitigation ambition. And I think maybe we'll see a different scenario starting to play out.
So would like to add?
No.
We have a question in the back.
Yeah, you both, actually all three of you have mentioned the need for innovation and rolling out these solutions faster. And in terms of the cost, you've been very clear that that's going down a lot faster than we hoped for, and that's a good thing. But in terms of the innovation side, how can we speed that up and roll things out faster in order to deploy them, at a low cost, in the field, both in the developing world and also in the developing world?
Well, there is no good answer for that. There are a lot of things that we tried over time. I have to say that in the energy sector, there's been a lot of stupid decisions that have been made over time by governments. Wrong starts, throwing a lot of money at silver bullet solutions that just weren't going to pan out. If you look at, in the U.S. energy sector, talk about repurposing technology or, worrying about the fixed commitment, the amount of money that was wasted on the sort of what was a premature start of nuclear energy in the 70s, where it just scaled up immensely under government encouragement, and it turned out there were problems with the technology, and huge amounts of money were wasted, plants that were started, never completed, etc. So we do this all the time, and we do it, a lot of times we do it stupidly. So my own advice would be that governments have to take a hard look at their policies towards innovation. They have to not be obsessed with single solutions. On the other hand, probably they have to be spending a lot more attention and more money on, in early days, starting to encourage technological change. And then when technologies start to be really promising, like some of the storage technologies now are, which are also a hindrance for renewable implementation, that they are able to quickly bring resources on those technologies, probably through private-public partnerships, closing the valley of death question and helping entrepreneurs move forward. But this is part of the problem that I actually am least optimistic about, because it's a long record of failure.
Maybe by nature slightly more optimistic, but Michael's exactly right. The ideal scenario is one of large investment in basic science and applied research, and then a very sort of hands-off, performance-based policy. That takes time to pull technologies out of the lab and get them into the field. So depending on your tolerance, your sense of urgency, especially if you think about like a World War II type scenario, you end up making a lot of decisions, and that's generally not, as Michael said, we're not really good at making those sort of decisions about which technology should really win and which shouldn't. On the other hand, if I think there's so many technologies that we know already work, and so much that we can do with what we have on the shelf, and so many sort of things that we could be doing now that make the whole solution set more easy. We touched on food earlier, diet change, reducing food waste. Those two levers already, I don't think any technology innovation buys you a huge amount of benefit, a broad spectrum of benefits, including reduced energy efficiency. We know how to make cars more efficient, we know how to make appliances more efficient, we know how to renovate houses. All of that, again, this doesn't take a lot of innovation, it just takes applying what we have and buys you time for greater innovation in some of the more complicated spaces. So if we're serious about it, we have the time to do the innovation that we'll need by 2040, by 2050 to get where we're going.
I also think it needs a disruptors in the field. I think the same way you have people like Elon Musk who's getting involved in storage, you have Richard Branson who has a very strong commitment to environmental issues. You need some of these people to now start affecting some of the grades and getting that sort of energy and money going towards innovation that I've seen the fact. We've done really well with cell phones, but we maybe we should start putting some of that energy to the saving the planet, because if we don't save the planet, itself is not going to be any use to. So if we can start getting them thinking in that direction, and it's something that everybody comes out feeling good about themselves and the role they play. So I think that's really where we have that there's been attempts to engage the private sector. And I think that's probably where we need to get the entrepreneurs to start putting money and putting resources, and particularly very strong technology towards those issues.
Thank you. There's an event right after this one, so I'm going to take the last question.
My name is Matthew, the United Nations Development Program. I work specifically on a project that supports vulnerable countries, performance specifically, and spend a lot of time working on 1.5 degrees because it's one of the key objectives for the climate resilience. I just wanted to raise a specific issue in relation to the climate movement itself. And when I say that, I mean all institutions, think tanks, academics, and others that are working in the climate movement, how that relates to the 1.5 degree target and public debate on it and follow-up to that. Because we find, in particular, in trying to push forward with communication on 1.5 and with the 1.5 campaign that we've launched with some of the groups, that there's still quite a considerable resistance in the civil society groups and in some of the leading academics on this 1.5 degree limit. And what was interesting also with Paris was that for the change, you had governments actually taking the lead on 1.5 without even civil society and other institutions that you might assume to be there behind them. And when we tried to create support for the 1.5 campaign, we met huge resistance from big civil society groups, many of which ultimately came on board sometimes as late as during the conference, Paris itself, behind 1.5. But there have been, very, very strong voices from very senior thinkers, many from North America. It's not to mention any names or anything, but they have been actively waging a communication, if you like, battle against adopting the 1.5 goal. And we see that that type of approach and anxiety is still persisting, and it manifests itself at the moment in alarming ideas about what the implications of making emissions with 1.5 degree goal are going to mean to geoengineering and other things. We know that actually between say 1.5 and 2 degree goal, these things are essentially identical. It's largely because we have done so little so far to reduce pollution that we are in any case faced with a negative emissions challenge in the second half of the century. But given the panel that is here, I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on how to address the internal dynamic within the climate movement to bring people on board on 1.5 degrees. Also to mention that together with the Stanley Foundation, the Climate Action Network, Care International, and some others, we're organizing a workshop tomorrow afternoon specifically on the topic of building a movement for 1.5 degrees. So actually to try and see how this can be scaled up further with wider involvement with institutions. And just, also to mention that this is somehow a problem within the United Nations as well. Before Paris, I think until the end of the Paris conference, the only senior UN official that got behind 1.5 degrees was the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I think until now, I haven't heard any. I think Christiana Figueres became after Paris very vocal on 1.5 degrees, but for instance, within the United Nations Development Program, it's not yet clear for me that this is something that we support actively. We have a zero emissions tagline, the zero emissions 2050 or 2099, with many very different outcomes for temperature. And I would encourage the ambassador and others here to also make the points known to the principals of the United Nations agencies and the executive board, because I think the agreement is there, but not everybody has understood that this should mean something different now that the Paris Agreement is there. What are the implications of it? So part of what we're trying to do with the 1.5 campaign is to mainstream the concept of 1.5 and people's consciousness now. but also to emphasize that if you really look at that argument too, what it's saying is in fact that from well below 2 could hardly be considered 1.6 or 1. Maybe 1.6, maybe absolute maximum, but basically 1.5 is the goal. It's not 2, maybe 1.5, it's basically 1.5. So I think if that message could get across to the agencies, through the same governments that are focusing on negotiations, it would be helpful.
Dr. Fletcher, you're smiling.
I was hoping you would choose the teacher. What I've said is absolutely correct. We saw it in Paris. That's why I said that the French really did play a big role in directing us towards 1.5. The questions that were asked in our facilitation group, one of the first questions was, how can we achieve a 1.5 degree Celsius goal? So the whole discussion was framed in such a way to get people to understand that we really wanted 1.5 degrees as a limitation. And there was not immediate buy-in on this at all, not just from some of the usual objectives, but others who felt, well, we're overshooting this 1.5, and are we running the risk of derailing this whole thing by our hard insistence on 1.5 that maybe we lose 2 degrees Celsius altogether? And yes, although we've come out of Paris with a very strong statement, an encouraging statement on 1.5, you're absolutely correct. I do not believe that everybody has bought into 1.5. Some of them see 1.5 in there as kind of like a security blanket for small island developing states. It's there, but nobody really thinks we'll get there. But if it's there, then they'll stop taking measures and they will be as agitated about this as they really are. But really, the goal you're shooting for is 2 degrees Celsius. And eventually, we'll show them that 1.5 is not very practicable. But if we give them enough money, then maybe they can, they can come around to the fact that they're not going to get 1.5. And that's why, for us, we keep saying, no amount of money can help you recover land that's been lost or lands that have been evaporated or coral reefs that have disappeared. So there is still a very, very strong fight. And that's why I love what Ronnie said so much. Really have to focus on not really whether or not 1.5, but yes, we have 1.5, so let's make 1.5 happen. And that has to be really our mantra. That has to be how we deal with this too, because there still are a lot of skeptics where 1.5 degrees Celsius is concerned. We're not living in some kind of fairy tale land to believe that we haven't. We really do have a lot of within the UN agencies, you're right. We haven't seen 1.5 featuring there at all. But it's not just the UN agencies, it's a lot of other agencies. There is really no strong discussion about 1.5 degrees Celsius yet.
Let me just say, if you're worried about civil society, I mean, there's a spectrum of organizations, and some of them will be guided by what they think the facts show. And, again, the case is complicated at 1.5, and some of them will continue to be hesitant about making it a central goal until they think it's feasible. And that may or may not change gradually over the next couple of years. Then there are other organizations that are going to ask the question of, can I organize support around this? What does 1.5 or 2 mean? It's too abstract to get the general public involved. There's an issue there. For instance, you could look at 350.org, which played an interesting role, but I think it's the case that what really got that organization going was to organize around a very specific question, like the Keystone Pipeline. So, it could be that you should ask the question, which of these groups do you need? Which are likely to sort of never come out on this issue because it's not useful to them. And then, don't worry so much about it. The groups that you need will come around and you can engage them. And the groups that you don't need, just don't worry about it. The civil society is very diverse. You're never going to organize it around a particular goal, particularly something so abstract.
Michael's right. I know we've got to be strategic about such a big sector, but yeah, it's an example of the sort of rapid transformation that Michael mentioned early on. This is the case of an example in the political sphere. It'll just take time for something to catch up.
Thank you. I will not try to summarize the discussions because I think they were very rich, but I have a few takeaways. I think some keywords came up in the discussion. A positive narrative, that we need to develop and reinforce. Success stories, the feasibility that 1.5 is doable. Mainstreaming 1.5, I can't agree more. 1.5 is in fact the goal of the Paris Agreement, that this needs to be better, probably better understood. A clear action plan out of Marrakesh. Marrakesh needs to be an important COP. This is not a transition COP. It needs to stand for itself, as the ambassador was mentioning. And finally, a word that came up several times: accelerate. We need to accelerate the implementation, action on the ground, find the resources, improve the science, speed up the technological innovation to make the transformation that is needed. I only have now to thank our presenters, our panelists, so maybe join me in giving them Thank you to you all for being with us today, for your participation. Again, all the presentations will be on the website. Please keep in touch, make sure we have your contact details so we can invite you to our next events. And enjoy the Climate Week. There's a lot of great events coming up, and stay tuned for the identification ceremony. We might cross the threshold this week. Thank you.